Hi friends, welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant Wilhelm. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. Shortly before the 20th July, I had sought out General von Seydlitz in Krasnogorsk. He briefed me on the developments in the central sector of the Eastern Front. In 14 days, the Red Army had pushed more than 350 kilometers to the west along a front some 300 kilometers wide. At the beginning of the offensive, they had conquered territory the size of Holland, Belgium, and Switzerland. Up until the 9th July, a further 14 German generals had been captured and 4 had fallen. Worth knowing was that for the first time a large formation, the remains of the 12th Corps under the command of Lieutenant General Vincenz Müller, had laid down its arms. By the middle of July 1944, the number of generals taken prisoner in the central sector had risen to 26, and at least 15 others had fallen. Army Group MIT had been defeated. From Lake Peipus to Gullaz, the Wehrmacht was fleeing back westwards under the blows of the Red Army. Arno von Lenski, who sought me out the next day, took on the formalities of my acceptance as a member of the League of German Officers. I was inwardly relieved that I no longer had to take this step. Looking back to clarify my way from the end of the Cauldron battle on the Volga, it seemed that as an active enemy of Hitler's I had been tardy and resistant. It was a fact. I had had many hurdles to cross to get through to the right theoretical acknowledgement of the military, political, and moral situation of Hitler's Germany. In Stalingrad, Hitler and his regime were unveiled as representing a system of cynical contempt and common betrayal. But I personally believed that I had gone the right way. Would I now be a traitor? Could I endanger my family in the homeland? Could I separate myself from the honored Field Marshal Paulus? The answers to these questions needed time to mature. A further way must be found for answering the question how I, as a prisoner of war, could contribute to the overthrow of Hitler, and what would happen afterwards. And for me then, just as I had achieved theoretical clarity over these conflicting problems, something else was necessary. The decisive, perhaps also the worst, civil courage. That was not like bravery in war. Behind bravery in war stands either directly or indirectly the order of the superior commander. The civil courage necessary for Germany to rise up against Hitler could not be based on that kind of order. Quite the contrary. It means the rejection of such orders. It conflicted with the voice of conscience and reason. During the next few days, I went to various discussions together with Generals von Seydlitz, Lattmann, Detrakorfs, and von Lenski. I was particularly delighted when I heard that Field Marshal Paulus was on his way from Volkovo to Moscow. Several days later, I visited him, together with von Seydlitz. Our conversation was especially friendly. Paulus was happy to have gotten away from the grumbling atmosphere of Volkovo. The news of the assassination attempt on Hitler had provoked indignation from most of these generals, although some of them had become uncertain. Paulus spoke openly of his sympathy for the National Committee, Freies Deutschland, and the League of German Officers. When I left him, I was convinced that we could soon reckon on his cooperation. Luniovo had been the seat of the National Committee, Freies Deutschland, and the League of German Officers for 2 years now, and my abode and workplace. There I came into close contact with generals and officers whom I already knew. General Walter von Seydlitz, a soldier through and through, who had already come out against Hitler in the Cauldron. Major General Detrakorfs, an historian who as early as the advance of 1941 had opposed the shootings of hostages and Jews. Major General Martin Lattmann, a former convinced National Socialist, who now saw Hitler's ideals as derisory and betraying. Major General Arno von Lenski, my closest friend and former cavalry officer. Colonel Luitpold Steele, the Catholic Action supporter and intrepid regimental commander. The engineer Majors Karl Hetz and Herbert Staslane. Major Heinrich Hohlmann, son of a Hamburg shipowner. Major Egbert von Frankenberg, a Luftwaffe officer from an old officer family, and Major Hermann Lorenz, secretary of the League of German Officers. Among the other members and colleagues of the National Committee that I got to know were the corporals or privates Hans Gossens, Dr. Gunther Kircher, Max Emmendorfer, Heinz Kessler, Reinhold Fleischhut, and Leonhard Helmschrott, workers, officials, and farmers in civilian life. An important role in the work of the Freies Deutschland movement was played by a group of Wehrmacht pages, among them the Catholic priests Joseph Kaiser, Peter Mohr, and Dara-Lois Ludwig, as well as the evangelical priests Johannes Schroeder, Nikolai Senishin, Matthias Klein, and Dr. Friedrich Wilhelm Kronecker. Dr. Kronecker was a senior consistorial advisor in the Berlin External Office. In the autumn of 1943, he was taken prisoner near Kiev. After the flight of the German troops, a Soviet Union Special State Commission established that during the occupation more than 195,000 innocent Kiev citizens, men, women, children, and old folk, had been shot, hanged, or poisoned. Dr. Kronecker had seen exhumed corpses from these massacres near Babi Yar, a ravine-ridden area on the edge of Kiev. Shattered by the bestial cruelty of this fascism, the evangelical divisional priest Kronecker joined the Freies Deutschland movement. He and 24 other pages, before they came to Lumiovo, had appealed to the Christians at the front, in which they said, "Hitler has lit the burning fires of this war with excessive arrogance. He has spread the conquest and rapine of foreign countries with frivolous openness as war aims. For these criminal aims he has let, without any moral rights, but only an extension of his powerful rule, millions of Germans shed their blood at the front, and has brought blooming cities back in the homeland, with women and children, to destruction in the air war. He has shamed the honor of the German name through unprecedented cruelties in the occupied countries, by means of bloody terror against other peoples. Over the course of time, I also encountered men who had been threatened with death or internment in concentration camps in Hitler's Germany, but had found asylum in the Soviet Union. There was the president of the National Committee, Freies Deutschland, and the writer Erich Weinert. Their names I had seen on leaflets, together with those of Walter Ulbricht and Willy Bredel, in the cauldron on the Volga. On the 3rd August 1944, I participated in a full session of the National Committee, Freies Deutschland. As guests were also invited 16 generals who had shortly before become prisoners of war, including Generals Volkers, Freiherr von Lützow, Vincenz Müller, Bamler, and Gallwitzer, who had disassociated themselves from Hitler in a proclamation concerning the 22nd July 1944. Action against Hitler is acting for Germany. They called out to the generals and officers on the Eastern Front. President Erich Weinert opened the session. Major General Lattmann analyzed the military situation resulting from the defeat of Army Group Mitte, which the National Committee had rightly foreseen. The war was approaching Germany's eastern borders with giant steps. The whole German nation was threatened with a Stalingrad if Hitler and his war did not come to an end. The discussion brought all-round supplements to Lattmann's presentation, including notebooks and letters found on fallen German soldiers and descriptions from the latest prisoners of war of the effects of the air war on the homeland. Under the massed attacks of British and American bombers, German towns were sinking in rubble and ashes. Already many old folk, women and children lay buried under the wreckage, and a robust-voiced general of infantry Volkers, the eldest ranking officer among the guests, reported on how the German corps and divisions had been destroyed in the central section. To the acclaim of those present, Generals Volkers, Gallwitzer, Hofmeister, von Lützow, Müller, Traut, Engel, and Klampt announced their joining of the League of German Officers. My heart bled when I heard these reports, but in Voikovo, a few hundred kilometers away, there were other generals who called these men traitors who had called for the overthrow of the government, but who themselves had inflicted frightful harm on their way and had thrust the people and nation into the abyss. After this session, I had to be alone. I sought out a bench at the far end of the park and went over my thoughts. It pained me to have heard all these things and reinforced me in my decision against Hitler and for a free Germany. In the coming days, I had many talks with the most recently arrived generals. Unfortunately, with some of them I got the feeling that things had happened too quickly for them. They'd all complained about Hitler, but hardly any of them said a word about having shortly before been obeying his orders. Hardly any of them said anything about how they thought the new Germany should look. One clear exception was Lieutenant General Vincenz Müller. As a Reichswehr officer in General von Schleicher's department, He had already had insight into the policies of the various national and military groups in Germany and also knew details about the preparations for war and the fascist conquest aims. Contrary to Hitler's basic prohibition, as deputy commander of the 12th Corps, he had given the order to surrender on the 8th July 1944, thereby saving the lives of thousands of soldiers surrounded east of the Ptitsch River. Honestly and soberly, Vinzenz Müller put his own past aside, but did not speak of being free from the responsibility for fascism. I also came into conversation with General Hofmeister. By chance he mentioned that he had reported an event to a chief of engineers who had flown out of the cauldron. "Colonel Sell?" I asked. Yes, that was his name. In the officers' mess of his former battalion in Hamburg Harbor, he had described before the officers and guests the criminal flippancy with which the 6th Army had been treated by the High Command in its defeat. But somebody must have betrayed him. He was arrested and sent to Spandau. Nothing further is known. I was sorry for Sell, but hats off to him. He had at least tried to call the person responsible by the right name. On the 8th August 1944, the day on which Field Marshal von Witzleben was hanged on the gallows in Berlin on Hitler's orders, Field Marshal Paulus abandoned the reserve that he had imposed on himself for more than a year and a half. That evening he spoke on Sender Freies Deutschland radio. Tensely, we sat in front of the radio in Luniovo. Then came the well-known voice. Recent events have made the continuation of the war a pointless sacrifice for Germany. The war is lost for Germany. Germany has come to this position through the leadership of the state in war by Adolf Hitler. From this comes the behavior of some of his representatives in the occupied territories who have acted against the inhabitants in a way that is abhorrent to all true soldiers and all true Germans, and must have produced the strongest reproaches from the whole world. If the German people do not dissociate themselves from this behavior, they must bear the full responsibility for it. Germany must rid itself of Adolf Hitler and get a new head of government to end the war and bring about circumstances that will enable our people to go on living and enter into peaceful, yes friendly, relations with our present enemies. On the 14th August 1944, Paulus announced his membership of the League of German Officers. A few days later, on the 22nd August, he added his signature at the full assembly of the National Committee, Freies Deutschland. At this meeting, General von Seydlitz reported on the work of the National Committee over the previous year. The multitude of tasks surprised me. Front, line addresses by loudspeaker, leaflets, and personal letters to the German commanders, discussions with prisoners of war immediately behind the front line, advertising and explaining in all prisoner of war camps, distribution of the Freies Deutschland newspaper and an illustrated magazine, radio programs broadcast from Moscow and often carried by various European stations. The military situation in Germany was approaching complete chaos. Only the day before, Romania had abandoned the war. The Balkan front had collapsed. The German troops in Greece and Crete were cut off. The Red Army was deep inside Hungary. Army Group South Ukraine was defeated. Army Group North surrounded with 350,000 men. In the west, the Allies, following their landing in northern France in June 1944, were advancing. Germany's home territory would become a battlefield in the immediate future. The National Committee, which wanted to hinder this development with all its might, declared once more that only a combined fight by the army and the people could alleviate the catastrophe. With this in mind, the National Committee decided at the 13th Full Assembly, at which Walter Ulbricht, speaking especially on the role of the Wehrmacht in the new phase of fighting, called for all weapons against Hitler. This was, in effect, a renewed demand to form a national people's front. The same theme came through 2 months later at the 14th Full Assembly, which centered on a report by Lieutenant General Vinzenz Müller, Volkssturm, the ultimate futility of Hitler's bankruptcy. I too had begun working, writing for the Freies Deutschland newspaper and discussing various problems on the radio. Because of my inclinations and knowledge, I went on working with the cultural group of the National Committee, in which, among other questions, the cultural organization of Germany was discussed and clarified. There were similar working groups for the economy, law, and social policies. Above all, however, I learnt and studied by myself. Every week there was a day of recitals and discussions. German politicians, trade unionists, writers, Soviet university lecturers, professors and officers offered a copious program. In Luniovo, I had oversight of all the National Committee's activities, as well as the organizational and educational work in the prisoner of war camps. There were representatives of the National Committee everywhere. From time to time, delegations left Luniovo for several days to assist and instruct in the camps. But no less important, right until the end of war, was the work of the National Committee at the front. In every sector of the Red Army front there was an authorized organizer. At his disposal were prisoner of war soldiers and officers available at the Army and divisional headquarters. They worked on the front line with the spoken and written word, predominantly with leaflets. There were some that explained the aims of the National Committee and called for men to cross over in large numbers. There were others that revealed the nature of the war and the Hitler government, that described Soviet captivity, and finally, in view of the local situation, the purposelessness of resistance. Also, personal letters sent back by captured generals or commanders played a certain role. A similarly important and effective means was the loudspeaker, in varying strengths and range. The transmissions had a similar effect to the leaflets, taking into consideration the immediate front activity. Ever more often, individual prisoners of war were sent back. Above all, they demonstrated what Soviet captivity entailed and disproved Goebbels' propaganda. Most of them had the task of forming Wehrmacht groups of the National Committee and of leading them to the front commanders at a set time. The movement's authorities valued the results of these activities highly, conducted talks with new prisoners of war, and explained to them at the collecting camps about captivity and the war situation. They carried out all of the work in their front sector and prepared the commissioned pamphlets, radio texts, and information. Lastly, they maintained liaison with the National Committee in Luniovo. Dear friends, that's all for today. Please support my channel with any comment. Thanks a lot. It was Tim, and see you.